we are very fortunate to have Ed Parsons speak to us on the topic of how we all became navigators. Ed was Google's geospatial technologist, was responsible for evangelizing Google's mission to organize the world's information using geography. In this role, he maintains links with governments, universities, research, and standards organizations which are involved in the development of geospatial technology. Ed leads Google's efforts in maintaining a healthy, open data ecosystem in Europe. He was the first chief technology officer in the 200-year history of the Ordnance Survey and was instrumental in moving the focus of the organization from mapping to geographical information. He came to the Ordnance Survey from Autodesk, where he was the application manager for GIS, Geographical Information Systems, for that division. He earned his master's degree in applied remote sensing from Cranfield, holds an honorary doctorate in science from Kingston University, London, and is a fellow of both this society and the Royal Institute of Navigation. Last year, Ed was awarded the Society's inaugural Professional Geography Award for excellence in the use of geography in professional practice. Ed, I'm delighted to welcome you to the stage tonight.
Well, thank you very much, and once again, Happy New Year, everyone. So it's a real pleasure to see you all here. I'm a regular to the Monday night lectures. I'm usually up there in the cheap seats with you guys. So it's nice to be looking at you as opposed to the other way around. So today I want to take us on a journey, literally, to better understand, explore some of the stories behind the technology that we've all become so familiar with. The mapping applications that we have on our phones that have become so much part of our lives. Where did that technology come from? How have we got to where we are today? And I want to do that by telling you some stories related to 6 particular places where not necessarily the most important developments happened, but the developments that happened there were still interesting and a major part to the development of the technology that we've all come to understand. A little bit about me. I describe myself as a digital geographer now, because actually I was a geographer by training. That's what I did for A-levels, that's what I did for my undergraduate degree. I kind of picked up computing along the way. I was never trained as a computer scientist. I kind of learned my programming as I went along, and I was always kind of a page ahead of my lecturers, so I could just kind of keep ahead. But that's what I am. I'm a geographer. Throughout my career, I've been interested in explaining the world around us. Why does it look like it does? And applying digital technology, computing, to that task. And obviously talking about maps. And I'm going to show a few maps here just to get us familiar. Here, the traditional Ordnance Survey map of Southampton, where the OSHQ is. Spent a fascinating few years working for the Ordnance Survey. That's a map. We all recognize that. We understand what that is. Most of us in this audience can read that map. We understand what all those squiggly lines mean, and we could probably navigate using that map. And navigation is what I'm going to focus on in this talk. This is another famous map. This is Beck's tube map. This is an example, an annotated example from an exhibition that was held towards the end of last year here in London, where many of the working examples of Beck's diagram, because he called it a diagram, were displayed. And you can see over time how the diagram developed and how Beck took a complex system for the London Underground and tried to use cartography, different cartographic techniques, to explain that in a way that it would be useful to the citizens of London or people visiting London to try and navigate, to work our way around that system. Both of those are examples of maps. Both of those are maps that you might use to navigate, some perhaps more easily than others. But that's not the only time, that's the only way people have used maps. Maps have been used for other purposes as well, clearly, to demonstrate activities happening around the planet as pieces of artwork. But what I want to talk about is how we use these maps to navigate, a specific use of maps, and a use that actually draws us in. It makes us more connected to that map than just a piece of artwork or something that we might want to display, because maps today are more widely used than they've ever been in our history. You often see the reports in the papers during the summer, oh, it's terrible, no one knows how to read a map anymore, isn't it awful? But actually, more people use maps today than at ever point in our history, because we carry them around with us. But we're not just carrying them around for the sake of it, we're actually using those maps on a day-to-day basis. Probably most of you, at least at some point today, use the Maps application on your device, on your phone, to get here, or to work out how you're going to have a journey across London. That's something that we interact with all of the time now. Google Maps, and I will bring up Google Maps just in this case because I know these figures, is the third most downloaded app that Google produces. Above Google Maps is YouTube and YouTube Kids. Don't know what that tells us about society. But the third most downloaded app is Google Maps, few. This is the most interesting figure. 2 billion users every month use Google Maps. So at some point during the month, at least 2 billion people are using the Maps application. So it is really part of our day-to-day lives. And I would argue it is because we have become navigators. We are using the tools that we have in our pockets to explore the world, to interact with that world, to look at the world differently at different times of day, different times of night, to do different tasks, because we are now navigating. We're not passively looking at a map, we're actively using that map to solve problems. Now, when we think about navigators, I'm sure you see pictures like this come to mind. So here we have some members of the Royal Navy navigating their ship. That's the navigation display on an Airbus airliner. You're seeing the navigation charts there. It seems complex. It seems something that you need to be skilled to do. Clearly, if you are navigating a ship or an airliner, there are skills associated with that. But fundamentally, we are all navigators today because we're using these applications to get, fundamentally, from A to B. And all navigation is solving this problem of getting from A to B. But to do that, it's actually quite complicated. A is where am I at that particular point in time. So a lot of what we're going to talk about this evening is finding out where A is. Where am I at any particular point in time? The next bit, getting to B, well, to understand B, my destination, I need to know where literally everything else in the world is. So it's easy. I just need to know where I am, and I need to know where everything else is, and then I can navigate between the two. So today, we're going to solve that problem, identifying where A is, where am I, and B, where is everything else? And then all I need to do is to connect to the two. We're used to navigating. This is the standard sort of sat-nav display that you have in your car. This one is being projected from a mobile phone. But if you've used, a TomTom or one of those devices, a personal navigation device that used to be called, you'd be very familiar with this. We're very familiar with using sat-navs, either something that we stick on the windscreen of our car, or maybe it's built into our car. We know how they work. We know that they now make use of real-time traffic information. They can tell us where there are speed cameras. Some of them can tell us what the weather conditions are. Very familiar with how that works. The big growth, though, has been with the development of maps applications on mobile phones. And here we see a lot of the characteristics of a mobile device that we carry around with us coming to the fore, because here we're getting personalized directions, saying I want to use public transport to get here to the World Geographical Society. And my preference is to use the underground rather than buses. I don't like using buses. So when I get directions, it automatically gives me routes that make use of the tube or the overground network rather than buses, because it knows my preferences. So those are my particular directions. At that particular time, it even tells me how much the fare is going to be and that there are minor delays on the Piccadilly line. Well, who'd have thought? And then when I arrive, I can get this last-minute view of what the building looks like. So, you know, that last bit of navigation where you're always wondering, oh, okay, I've got to what I think is the right address. What am I looking for? Well, I can now pull up a building, picture, pretty much of any urban area anywhere in the world. Those are accessible to you. And where the real growth has come is taking that technology of locating where you are, locating where activities are in real time, and then embedding that in other applications. So here is, you know, Uber. Uber is making use of that same fundamental mapping technology to make sure that the car comes to you, whether it's going to pick you up and take you somewhere else, or it's going to deliver food to you. It's using the same underlying technology. So how did we get here? How has maps, how have mapping technologies become so widespread? What's happened? Well, we're going to go on a journey. We're going to go on a journey, and it will cover two major themes. One of those themes is accessibility, taking something that was once only in the hands of a few people because it was very complicated or very expensive, and making it accessible to everybody. That's a major trend that we will see through this story. Something that was very specialized suddenly becomes mainstream. The other big trend is what I call technology accretion, and that is technology building on other technology, building on other technology. So different technologies are combined and added on to give you a new system, a new service. So when I talk about accessibility, let me give you the perfect example. This is a famous satellite image, the Blue Marble, taken in 1972 by the crew of Apollo 17. Here they are, Cernan, Evans, and Schmidt. There's some argument about who took the photo, obviously, because they're astronauts and they will argue with each other over these sorts of things. It was either Evans or Schmidt, but they argue about it. They took the image on their way back. If you remember your moon landing history, Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon. So these were the last people to come back and see that image. Now, we're very familiar with that image. But we've never seen that. We've seen the picture many times. Actually, as of today, there are only 4 people alive who have seen that with their own eyes. There are only 4 Apollo astronauts who went to the moon that are still alive and saw that with their own eyes. But we're very familiar with that because we see it every day, represented in the tools that we use and in day-to-day life. It's something that's accessible to us. We can take our Earth and we can look around it and we can zoom in and we can explore. That's something that was only something that was visible to 4 people alive today is something that we all have accessible to us today. Another point I want to deal with is the common debate, and we're having this discussion just before Christmas, friends of mine. You know, you often get presented with the fact that you can either do geography or you can do history. They're separate subjects, geography or history. If you have to take an option, maybe at school you can do geography or you can do history. What I'm going to do today is say, no, they're the same. We're not going to separate them. We're going to explore history using geography, and we're going to use geography to explore history. Some ways it goes back to physics. This is Hermann Minkowski, who developed the concept of space-time. He was one of Einstein's tutors. And he basically said, well, listen, space and time are really the same thing. You can't separate them. So we're not going to separate geography and history. We're going to use space-time as a way of exploring the development of this technology. So we're going to visit now these 6 places where maps changed forever. So let's go to the first place. And where do you go when you're starting a really exciting journey of discovery? Heston Services. I don't know why you're laughing. Heston Services is quite nice. Well, no, I'm fibbing. We're not actually going to Heston Services. What we're actually going to do is skip over the motorway and go to an industrial estate beside Heston Services. I think, okay, where are you taking this? Well, if you look around, this is a very 1990s industrial estate, apart from this building here. You see that? The one with a curved roof. I'm a bit of an aviation enthusiast. That's a hangar. And that's a hangar because it's one of the remaining buildings from our first destination, Heston Aerodrome in 1938. Those of you who've got any awareness of history will probably be familiar with this picture. Here we have Chamberlain returning from Munich in September 1938 with his piece of paper, Peace in Our Time, his memo signed by Herr Hitler promising that absolutely, Czechoslovakia, I'm not going to go anywhere else, promise you. Now, you will notice behind Chamberlain, there's an aeroplane. It's a Lockheed. Heston was, if you like, the emerging airport for London after Croydon. It's kind of like the executive airport, maybe a bit like Luton or Farnborough today. The Lockheed that has taken Chamberlain back from Munich was operated by British Airways. The British Airways then was a slightly different British Airways than the one today. They operated lots of executive aircraft manufactured by Lockheed and imported into the UK for general executive use. If you'd have looked just beyond this crowd and around the corner to another hangar, you'd have seen this particular aircraft, Golf Alpha Foxtrot Tango Lima. This aircraft is famous in the history of aerial photography and development. It was made available by British Airways, imported by British Airways, to this man. This man is Sidney Cotton. Sidney Cotton was, I don't know how best to describe Sidney Cotton. He was an entrepreneur. He was a trader of shares and property. He developed during the First World War a suit for pilots to wear that would keep them warm. But maybe the best way of describing him is he's a bit like Elon Musk of the 1930s. If there was a telephone box, he'd have an argument with whoever was in that telephone box. He was roped in by a chap called Frederick Winterbottom, who was the air attaché for MI6, because Winterbottom wanted someone to fly photo reconnaissance missions over Nazi Germany. Obviously, not being able to use RAF aircraft to do so, he bought that Lockheed for Sidney Cotton, and Sidney Cotton modified the aircraft to be able to go and fly clandestine missions across Nazi Germany to take photographs. Now, up until this point, aerial photography was usually something that you did with a handheld camera. You literally took the camera, you poked it out the window, and you took a picture as you were going past the area that you were interested in. What Cotton did was to introduce a systematic approach. The aircraft, Sidney Cotton's Lockheed, was recently restored, was brought back to the UK about 2 years ago. And in the restoration process, they worked out where Cotton attached these cameras. And they attached two cameras looking down through secret hatches in the bottom of the fuselage so he could take stereo photographs, stereo images, as he flew over Nazi Germany. That is how we do aerial photography today, and this was something that Sidney Cotton developed. He also developed the systematic approach of processing those images here to the Danesfield Hotel, just near Henley-upon-Thames, which was once known as RAF Medmerham. And RAF Medmerham was where all the aerial photography during the Second World War was processed by photo interpreters. Most famous of which was Constance Babington Smith, who did a lot of the processing that identified where the V2 rockets and the Tirpitz was located. But what's important here, what's interesting, is they developed this systematic approach to managing and manipulating aerial photos. It wasn't just a case of, quick, we'll take a picture. They developed the process of storing, putting those images in libraries, going back and revisiting those libraries in a systematic approach. Created the approach that we now use, not just for aerial photography, but for satellite imagery as well. So that's Heston's part in this story. Where are we going next? You knew this place was going to come up in the story. This is the Pentagon. And this is the Pentagon in 1973, and in particular, the Labor Day holiday of 1973. So if you've ever been to Washington in the summer, you know it gets very hot, very humid, very sweaty. Labor Day is kind of the public holiday beginning of September. 1973, because of the energy crisis, at the weekends, the power was cut off for the Pentagon office. So if you had a meeting at the weekend, it was hot and sweaty because there was no air conditioning. And here I want to introduce you to this chap in the middle here. This is USAF program manager, Brad Parkinson. A lot of the developments that we're going to talk about in terms of technology are no longer the product of one man, of one genius. You can't do that these days. It's so complicated. Developing systems that involve thousands of engineers, different stakeholders. The heroes are people called program managers. They're people that bring together all of these different organizations, different groups, and try and achieve a complex task. Brad there in the middle is surrounded by a civilian contractor, note the natty jacket, from the Aerospace Corporation, and a chap from the United States Navy. What they are developing is the Global Positioning System, GPS, back in 1973. Now, this meeting, it was called the Lonely Halls meeting, involved about a dozen or so people, different program managers from the United States Air Force, from the Navy, and from some commercial operators, stuck in a room, 2 days, no air conditioning, working out the design of a system that would allow a navigation system to be developed that was passive. What passive meant was that you could receive the signals without you broadcasting your location, which is quite important for military systems. Now, they weren't starting from scratch. There were actually navigation satellite surveys, that systems that had been developed way back in the 1960s, as soon as satellites were launched. But what the Lonely Halls meeting did was to decide on some key principles that are still there in the GPS satellites that we recognize today. The main one was to say, well, we want a global system that will work everywhere. Initially, they were thinking of GPS as a local system, particularly focused at Vietnam. They wanted to be able to provide navigation instructions for Vietnam. But they said, well, no, maybe there's a global need to do this. To locate yourself in space using trilateration, you need at least 4 satellites visible in the sky at any particular point in time. If you want to do that anywhere in the globe, at any point in real time, you need a minimum of 24 satellites to do that. So it takes 4 satellites to locate you. If you want to do that everywhere in a reasonably efficient manner, you need 24. You need a particular way of modulating the signal that comes from these satellites, a technology called CDMA. CDMA you'll now find in your mobile phones. It's the same technology. And they wanted to develop lightweight receiving equipment. The Rockwell Collins GPS receiver from 1977 was mobile. It had wheels. But it weighed 120 kilograms, compared to the Garmin that you might have on your wrist today, weighs about 50 kilograms. Therein is an accessibility example. The technology, interestingly enough, was always going to be developed that it would have civilian uses as well as military uses. They were quite smart to say, look, this is going to be really expensive to develop, multiple billions of dollars to develop this system. Let's at least give the possibility that we'll have civilian uses as well to help fund the process. And it became really, really valuable and important in the first Gulf War in the 1990s. This is a Magellan 1000 GPS receiver. This was the first GPS receiver I used, although mine wasn't this khaki color. It was originally designed for yacht owners for maritime navigation. And what happened, why Magellan started producing these in khaki, was that troops deployed in the first Gulf War didn't have access to GPS equipment themselves. It wasn't built into their tanks, their airplanes, whatever. So they would write home to their parents back in North America, say, hey, can you send a GPS receiver? It would be really useful because, you know, I'm driving in the desert and I don't know where I am, but this would be really helpful. So Magellan, for a long time, were producing these khaki GPS receivers for parents to send to their kids deployed overseas. Now, you can see it's quite a beefy piece of kit. It's probably so high, weighs a couple of kilograms, because the GPS signal that you're getting from those satellites is very weak. You need a lot of electronics to be able to pick that up. So much so that when you get your phone and you're getting that little blue dot telling you where you are, you think, oh, well, I'm using GPS. Most of the time, you're not using GPS because of the power consumption of having your GPS receiver in your phone switched on. Probably you're using other technologies. You'll notice in this room there are Wi-Fi hotspots. Those Wi-Fi hotspots have a unique ID associated with them, and they're in a particular location. So there are databases now of Wi-Fi hotspots and their locations, and a lot of the times your location in a Maps application is being based on where the local Wi-Fi transmitter is as opposed to GPS. Okay, so where are we going to go now? So far, the location where we have been pretty independent of each other. There's been no real connection. Now we're going to deal with 3 locations that are within a few miles of each other in Silicon Valley. Why Silicon Valley? Why is Silicon Valley Silicon Valley? Well, largely through accident, largely through Bill Stockley coming back from Bell Labs, back to where his parents lived, the location of Stanford University nearby, massive development of technology. My first location in Silicon Valley is a place called the Blue Cube. Now, fair enough, you can't see the Blue Cube because it's not there anymore. But if I put this picture up, there is the Blue Cube. The Blue Cube was the United States Air Force mission control for their own secret satellite missions. So, you know, Houston, I have a problem. This was the US Air Force version of that. So this was their mission control. And it was mission control for the series of spy satellites that the Americans launched from the late 1950s onwards. In the 1960s, these spy satellite missions were known as the Gambit series, KH-9. And these were basically a satellite that you launched from a rocket that had a traditional camera with film, had about 3,000 feet of film in the satellite, and it would take pictures. So you think, okay, well, how did that work then? How did they get the film? Well, what they used to do was to drop the film off in little capsules, and those capsules would be picked up by an aeroplane flying along, and they would grab the capsule and then go and process that picture when they needed to. So it worked pretty well. It was what was used in the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. But clearly, it was not as practical as it could be. What changed things was the development of this. This is the Charge Coupled Device, a CCD. A CCD is an integrated circuit that turns light into an electrical signal. And you have a CCD in all of your pockets, because it's part of the camera in your mobile phone. Now, the CCD was invented in the 1960s, found its way into a series of American spy satellites called the Kennen or KH-11 series. So now, rather than having to drop a capsule, I can beam back the image that I'm acquiring pretty much in real time, because I'm, in effect, taking a digital picture. Now, if you've ever seen the Hubble Space Telescope, this satellite is about the same size as the Hubble Space Telescope. It's fundamentally a big mirror with a CCD at one end. And this will allow you to take an image, and again, people are vague about the actual resolution that is possible to capture with a KH-11 satellite, but probably down to about 10 centimeter resolution anywhere on the planet. But the problem that the American defense and security agencies had was, this is fantastic, we've developed these great satellites, but it's really hard to get hold of the images. We need a better way of managing the images. Now, the images themselves are acquired using a sensor that uses a red, green, and blue filter. And sometimes when you look on a satellite image and you see an airplane flying, you'll see it's kind of blurred and it has a red blur, a blue blur, and a green blur. That's because the sensors are picking up that image at slightly different times and then giving you that strange blurring effect. The Earth now is covered with satellite imagery that comes from, obviously not military satellites, but civilian satellites like Landsat, the Copernicus program, SPOT, and so on. Huge volumes of satellite imagery available to us. Again, something that you will see in your mobile phones, all developed from this military technology of the 1970s. Back to Silicon Valley and this location. This location is the Googleplex, i.e. Google's head office in Mountain View. And in 1996. But in 1996, it wasn't the Googleplex. It was actually the headquarters of another IT company called Silicon Graphics. And Silicon Graphics built very high-end computers, very powerful graphic workstations, things like this. This is the SGI Onyx. And I remember dreaming about owning one of these because that is the price of a house that you're looking at. And they were this lovely purple color, really nice. Very high-end, at the time, very powerful graphics systems that were used for making Hollywood movies and high-end graphics displays. Now the sort of thing that you'll have, again, in your mobile phone in terms of graphics capability. Some engineers who were working in SGI were wanting to demonstrate the capability of their computers. And these are really powerful, very high-end. What graphics task can we demonstrate how good these computers are? And one of the engineers, a chap by the name of Brian McClendon, had seen a video, well, a film that went around the art houses of cinemas in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, by Ray Eames. And I'm going to show you that video. It's called Powers of 10.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago was the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now, every 10 seconds, we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds, the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Powerboats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is 1 kilometer wide, 1,000.
Zoom out all the way to the end of the galaxy. So the engineers thought, this will be great. We can demonstrate this by getting some of this new satellite imagery and being able to zoom in and out without having to take lots of individual pictures. We can do that very fluidly. And they developed a piece of software called the Keyhole Earth Viewer, knowing that keyhole would mean something to the defense and intelligence community. Because no one else knew what keyhole meant, but the defense and intelligence community did. Because, as I said, the defense and intelligence community were really struggling with being able to manage all of these images that were being acquired, and they couldn't get access to them, and they'd have to write memos and orders to get the images they wanted. If only there was some way of getting those images on the computer displayed really, really quickly. And that's what the Keyhole Earth Viewer did. It would allow you to put lots of satellite imagery on a server somewhere and access it using a relatively simple piece of software. Still software that came on a CD, and to be honest, the Keyhole company, who were these ex-SGI engineers, they struggled. They struggled for a good few years in traditional, startup style, just about being able to manage paying the bills at the end of the month. Until, again, another Gulf War happened, this time the invasion of Iraq, which was covered extensively by CNN and those cable news networks, who used the Google Earth Viewer to demonstrate what was happening over Baghdad. They had no other way of displaying it. Literally overnight, the company was saved because of that display of their software on CNN. And then just a year or two later, Keyhole was acquired by Google, and the Earth Viewer became Google Earth. Now, why did Google acquire Earth Viewer? Well, one story you hear, and I think there's probably quite a lot of truth in this, is that Larry and Sergey, the founders of Google, thought, well, that's cool, we'll buy that. That's probably true. The other story is that they saw the value in Google Earth as a mechanism for people creating more geographical content. Because the original idea of the Google Earth was that you could go and look at images anywhere on the world, and you could add your own content on top. Places you visited, restaurants, places you found interesting. And that's true. There was an element of crowdsourcing behind Google Earth. So the technology came from the Keyhole company that had been acquired by Google, but the big difference was Google came with a checkbook. a checkbook that allowed imagery for the whole planet to be purchased. For the first time, it was accessible to everyone. Where previously you had to be in the military or you had to be in a government agency, now everyone could get access to that imagery. Everyone could have it displayed on their computer very quickly, very easily. Okay, zip across Silicon Valley to this location. This is the old Apple headquarters at One Infinite Loop. And it was here that what was developed? Yes, the iPod. Bet you thought I was going to say the iPhone. The iPhone's coming. The iPod, I would argue, is every bit as influential as the iPhone was. iPod was developed in 2001 by Tony Fadell and John Rubinstein. And what, for the first time, this developed was the idea that you could put in your pocket lots and lots of the content, information that you cared about, i.e., all of your CDs, all of your music will be sitting in your pocket, and you could listen to it anywhere. That was still quite a big shift in thinking. It was quite a big concept to say, actually, I should be able to take this information wherever I want to go. Plug in my little white earphones and listen to music wherever I want. The other thing that it did was kind of invisible, but perhaps even more influential, was the iTunes store that sat behind the iPod that allowed you to purchase music online and have it downloaded and synced onto your iPod. It developed that relationship between a service that sits in the cloud somewhere and a device that you carry around in your pocket. But of course, equally important in our story was this, the development of the iPhone. Back in 2007, if you've not seen the demo, it's well worth watching it on YouTube. It's a great demo. Here's the original iPhone. It still works. I can still use Google Maps on this original iPhone. Still works. What we forget about the original iPhone was that it didn't have a GPS receiver in it. Didn't have 3G. It was quite slow. But it was still an amazing device because it started to bring all of these technologies together. The iPhone 3G that came out in 2009 did bring a GPS receiver. So you had then in your pocket a device that knew where you were, the A-bit, and to some extent knew where everything else was, the B-bit, but not perhaps in as much detail as we might want. So this was absolutely key technology. We take it all for granted now. Very influential, but there was one piece missing. There's one destination that we need to visit on our trip to finish our story. Where might that be? Can you guess? Yes, the Isle of Wight. This is the Griffin Public House in the Isle of Wight. It was the location of a party that was started by a 23-year-old student who started off doing computer science, found out he wasn't very good at doing computer science, then moved into doing physics. Wasn't that good at doing physics, but did various projects. This chap was Steve Coast. And Steve Coast developed a now famous project called OpenStreetMap. And what OpenStreetMap was a system for creating maps that could be created by anybody. So he had a party in the Isle of Wight, a bunch of about 40 people cycled, drove, walked around the Isle of Wight with a GPS receiver, and they built a map. They built a map in the same style, using the same kind of methodology that Wikipedia uses. So anyone can create the content, anyone can edit it, everyone has access to it, and you can pretty much use OpenStreetMap for whatever purposes you want. You don't have to ask anyone, you just go and you create it. And over the period of a weekend, carrying these little Gecko GPS receivers, you might remember these, plugged into your laptop, you could run around, follow the traces that you were making, and create a map. Amazing. Now, if you believe all the stories about OpenStreetMap, you'll believe that that's how most of the map was created, by people running about with GPS and recording stuff and visiting the places that they've made maps of. In reality, where most of the content of OpenStreetMap has come from is through people digitizing content on top of that satellite imagery that we spoke about earlier. Very early on in the OpenStreetMap project, Bing, who were the mapping organization of Microsoft, made their global satellite imagery database available, because everyone was getting into making these satellite databases available to people. They made it easily available to the OpenStreetMap community, and people started digitizing on top of that, adding their content using online tools. But it really worked. It really worked to the extent now that if we look at an aerial image of the Griffin pub, you can see it there. Actually, interestingly enough, it has a maze in the back garden. It's kind of appropriate. But if I switch on the OpenStreetMap layer, eventually it will come in, hopefully. There we go. You'll see the level of detail that OpenStreetMap achieves. You've even got those picnic benches in the garden of the pub. So this is content that people have created literally now all around the world at that kind of level of detail. So if I keep zooming out, you go anywhere and see this OpenStreetMap content, incredible levels of detail, more than you would see on most other maps. And this is available all around the world, developed by a community of interested people. There's arguments about how many people are actively doing this, but certainly millions of people have registered on their website, and these maps are maintained, and they form part of that ecosystem of mapping data that we all make use of today. So if you've got a Tesla car inside the navigation system of that, there's some OpenStreetMap content. Apple used OpenStreetMap content in Apple Maps. It's found its way through all sorts of different applications and services. And it's been developed, it's been created by that technology accretion, by all of these things adding on top of each other. Finally getting to this point where, because you've got widespread and easy access to satellite imagery, we can get a community to develop the tools that can then digitize that content and create maps of the world. Amazing how we've got to where we've got. But I'm going to finish off with a final thought. So we now all have in our pockets these devices that we carry around with us that have that full ability to do the A to B. A, i.e., where are you, comes from, yes, GPS, but also all the other sensors that we talk about because of energy consumption and so on. And we have B. We have literally a map of the world that is created, yes, by professional organizations that create content, but also by the community. We have very rich content that's maintained and created so it's up to date. Your map on your mobile phone is refreshed probably every 20 seconds. So every 20 seconds you have a new version of the map, reflecting the fact that the world keeps changing. Really, it means today, as a society, we will never be lost. Think about it yourselves. When was the last time you had that horrible feeling of, I don't know where I am, I'm lost? It's something alien to us now because we can just pull out our phone and look at that little blue dot and it will tell us where we are. That's incredibly powerful. That's incredibly reassuring if you're someone that doesn't like being lost, doesn't like not being able to share their location. If you dial 999 on your phone, your very precise location is automatically shared with the emergency services, wherever you are in the UK, down to 5-meter accuracy location. So if you need help, just dial emergency services, you'll get it. They know where you are because of this underlying technology. But my final thought is this. Just because we have that capability never to be lost doesn't mean that we have to use it all the time. It's very easy, and actually very healthy and valuable, to go and explore a city you've never been to before, switch your phone off, put it in your back pocket, and not think about it. Because you know, if you really get lost, you can then just pull it out and switch it on. But actually, do we all want to spend those really precious moments visiting a city we've never visited before, going, oh, well, what shall I go and see now? Oh, I'll go this way. We don't want that. We want to have that ability. We want to have that capability to never be lost, but control it. It's a technology that's there. We can make use of it if we really want to, but it doesn't mean that we have to all the time. And on that point, before my voice gives out, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ed. Taking us on an A to B on the journey of how we use maps today, and through the history of how this has all come about. And I'm talking of history, of course, this audience knows that history is just geography with a timeline. And also, I really love the idea, and I've been putting this into practice recently, the joy of getting lost, and that's a lot of fun. So you can ask, whilst some of us are leaving, please do use the rgs.org/questions to post any questions, and I will be picking them up on this magical device here. And also, if you could catch my eye, thank you very much indeed. And there are some microphones coming around. I think the gentleman at the back will try and get round everybody if we can. And if you could please use the microphones to ask the questions in order so the audience at home can hear what you've got to say and hear the responses. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone on?
Yep.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Many in this audience will recognize the question I'm about to ask. A debate I often have with my young daughters who are beginning to drive about sat-navs. Now, my instinct is always to set it north, so that I know if I'm traveling, say, from Oxford, where I live, to Bath, I'm traveling west, and I can see that on the map. The instinct for many younger people is to put it so you're just following your nose, so you have no sense of where you are. Could you comment on that in terms of a certain generation having mental maps in their head, and as I say Bath, most people here would know how to navigate their way to it, and they know it's west of here. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point, and something that we end up discussing a lot. You know, there is a convention that north is at the top. It's purely a convention. Most of us, I think, will probably find it easier when we're navigating that the direction that we're heading in is the direction that we're facing. That said, actually, if you can keep north at the top on your sat-nav and do that mental conversion as you're driving, you know, it gets particularly difficult if you're driving south and north is at the top because left is right and right is left. But if you can do that mental conversion in your head, I know some people that have done some work at a university college hospital looking at brain scans of people as they navigate. And actually, you begin to develop a capability, a muscle memory, to do that conversion, that spatial reasoning. And it's the same part of the brain that is often impacted by Alzheimer's. So there's an argument that says if you can do that spatial gymnastics of keeping north at the top and doing the conversion as you're working, you'll maybe keep your brain a bit healthier a bit longer because you're doing those mental gymnastics. So that's a tip for you. Keep north at the top. But if you get lost, it's not my fault.
So I think there's some questions over here. Thank you. Oh, right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. And really a follow-on point from the previous discussion. There's a sport called orienteering, which is linked to your point about staving off Alzheimer's by practicing the art of navigating whilst running. And actually, the study's been shown, there's a Canadian paper which showed your point that you just made. Given your knowledge in this space, that you're saying that actually it is beneficial for us to sometimes rely on our heads a bit more, what can you suggest Google Maps does to enable that a bit more? Because you know the app is very functional and really helpful when we're going to new places, but we should make sure that we are also keeping that hippocampus going.
Yes. I would love to be able to say that I've had many arguments with the product designers of Google Maps, and they've always listened to me. But no. We try to give people the choices. So you can, in Google Maps, choose to have north at the top in the setting. But actually, show of hands here, how many people on their phones have north always at the top when you're navigating? That's probably about a third, maybe. So still, most people will prefer, and it's very hard when people say, oh, no, but I want it like this, to disagree with them. There are many other things that we could do differently, and given the time, I will spend an hour talking about all of the things that I think are wrong with Google Maps that we should change. There are lots of things. Google Maps is a product that has developed now over 20 years, and it's had a lot of stuff poured into it, and we could probably do with taking quite a lot of that stuff out, but it's not my job anymore.
Right, so gentleman at the back there.
Ed, thanks very much. I was very interested in your build-up of how maps are put together today, but what about the role of some of the government agencies like the Ordnance Survey, who've got a great history of gathering information and putting it on paper? I guess that's a bit old-fashioned now, but what's their role in all this today, please?
Yeah, I think the government agencies, Ordnance Survey being the classic example, still have a really important role to play, usually because they are often what's termed the canonical source. They are the source of truth for many types of data. Particularly, in this country, the Ordnance Survey has a very close relationship with the land registry. So when you buy and sell property, the plan that delimitates your property is based on Ordnance Survey mapping, and you couldn't imagine that being delivered by Google or OpenStreetMap, for example. So when there are important legal societal processes, I think it's very important that there is a government agency responsible for those, and responsible to the extent that they will stand behind the quality and the accuracy of the mapping. That said, though, clearly how those organizations operate is going to change drastically as technology changes. And I think it means that the kind of very perhaps distinct dividing lines between what governments do and what the private sector does will blur. But I think there will always be a role. Maybe it will end up where national mapping agencies have a responsibility for validating and applying the quality measures to data that's captured elsewhere. Because fundamentally today, most of the cartography that you'll find on the Maps application on your phone is coming from, I hate to say it, machine learning and artificial intelligence. That is doing a lot of the cartography now. machines can very easily do what that OpenStreetMap diagram image showed you, kind of delimiting a building. A machine can do that really easily. So, you know, the future is probably going to be those agencies validating the content that's created by an artificial intelligence.
Okay, where's the microphone got to now? Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, that leads very nicely onto my question, Ed. Thank you for your talk. So as we know, we've got petabytes of satellite imagery being collected today. We've got more and more countries getting in on the GPS game. We've got AI in the mix. We've got cloud computing and everything connected. What do you think the future holds for, say, the next 10, 20, 30 years of these technologies?
All of the above. So more data, clearly. And as a result of more data, probably more artificial intelligence to interpret that data. Because fundamentally, our business, if you make maps, actually what you're interested in is change. You want to know where something is different to what it was previously. So as much as possible, if you can automate that process, make it quicker, make it more efficient, using artificial intelligence to do that, then that's probably what you're going to do. Also, if you think about all of those satellites, and you're absolutely right, you know, Tim Marshall mentioned it in the lecture last year, there are an enormous number of satellites that are being launched now with this imaging capability to pretty much image the Earth in real time. The only way you can do that is to have machines interpreting the images. There's just not enough humans to look at all of that content. And actually, it would make no sense beaming down all these images that's exactly the same as last time. So if you can put some artificial intelligence actually on the satellite to say, only show me things that have changed, then that changes the dynamics. So I think, you know, as I've mentioned in the talk, it's going to be a case of all of these things coalescing, all of these technologies ablating on top of each other to develop these new capabilities. But, you know, the future for our industry is really bright because most of the world's problems are going to be solved by the application of geospatial technology, by better understanding what's happening around the planet and being able to deal with that more quickly. Speed is the big differentiator now.
Thank you. I think we'll go to this gentleman here first, and I know that there's some hands over here. I hope they'll get to everybody.
How much of the planet is still not mapped or mapped very crudely?
I'd say probably most of the planet is mapped to probably the level of detail that we had in the UK 10 years ago. So everywhere is mapped to that level. There are some parts of the world where it's more difficult to make maps. My family will tell you I keep talking about going to North Korea. I'd love to make maps of North Korea. They also have some really interesting old Russian airliners that I'd like to see. But it's that we could do much better in North Korea. And obviously, China is a whole different kettle of problems and difficulties in terms of the laws and the legal requirements for making maps there. But actually, pretty much for the sort of map that you might look at and say, well, that looks pretty detailed, most of the world is captured. Where there is a big difference, and this is where I think, you know, as society, we need to put a lot of effort. There aren't necessarily addresses for people around the rest of the world. So we take it for granted we can order something from Amazon, we put in our postcode, or we just start typing our address, and it fills in automatically. And that address has a location associated with it, and something can get delivered. Great. For most of the world, that's not the case. Most of the world don't have a civic address system. So although there's maps of roads and locations of some buildings, individuals won't necessarily have addresses, which means all of those sorts of services aren't available to them. They're not really part of society as a result of that. So that's the big missing piece. It's usually invisible, I guess, from a map, but that's where the real effort needs to go in creating civic addresses for those parts of the world that don't have them.
There are plenty of questions coming on online, but Ed, you are doing really well. You're keeping ahead of the questions, or the audience here is keeping ahead of the questions online, so they are being answered. Thank you. There's a gentleman here.
Ed, I enjoyed your talk very much, thank you. How do the people at Google see what three words? You mentioned that if I phone 999, they know exactly where I am, but I understand that more and more people are using what three words. Is that a competition or a complementary service?
Okay. I'm going to speak in a personal capacity as opposed to Google. I think what three words is the biggest waste of time and money on the planet, and I think it just doesn't need to exist. Solves no problem. It's taken a load of money from investors that they will never see again. I think it's a scam. Absolutely no value in it whatsoever, particularly for emergency applications. As I said, for at least 5 years in this country and around the rest of Europe, when you dial 999 on your mobile phone, your address, your location is automatically shared with emergency services. The precise location that what three words now turn into random three words that you then have to download an app and all the rest of it. You don't need any of that. So it's not complementary, it's just not needed.
Right, I think there's a couple of questions just over here. Oh, round of applause for that one. And I know there's a lady over there as well that's very, yes, thank you. And we'll see how we get on with that before we wrap up. Okay. Okay, right, thank you. There's a lady behind you there. Yep.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I find it really interesting, the history of the relationship between navigation and like defense and military and all of that, which your examples showed really clearly. I just was interested in your thoughts on that relationship, and also if you think that relationship kind of still holds true now and will do in the future.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. And I think there's an element where you can see the balance changing almost in the presentation. I think, early on, 60s, 70s, clearly the military were leading in developing these capabilities, be it satellite navigation, Earth observation, computing, and so on. But there was a point, probably in the 1990s, where that switched a bit, actually. And I think now it's the commercial sector that's driving the shift in technology that the military is then trying to play catch up with. So it's more complex now. And that, that slide of the car-key GPS receiver, I think is really indicative of that change, where suddenly people were literally buying these GPS receivers in the duty-free shop in Dubai on the way to being deployed in the Middle East, because their military bosses couldn't provide it to them, but they could buy one in the duty-free shop. And I think that shift is really interesting.
Question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I would like to ask you to comment on the following. Maps are essentially a representation of reality, which is like the first basic thing. So could you please comment on the challenges of representing what you're showing, especially considering that the recognition is a cultural thing, to recognize that, and how can we, or if there is possible for people from like those places that you said, for instance, they don't even have an address, to contribute with a different view of representation, and make it more like universal.
Yeah, I mean, I focused quite a lot on imagery in the talk, because with imagery, unlike traditional maps, there's no interpretation. Well, there's no interpretation that has led to a cartographic decision. What you see is pretty much what the world looks like. Every map, as we all know, is the product of a cartographic process that removes information. It takes the complexity and focuses on particular areas. And I think nothing is going to change in terms of that fundamental requirement of cartography. We will always have to choose what we represent on a map, and what's important, I think, is that we recognize that that process has happened. So when we look at a map, we need to say, okay, a cartographer has made a choice to put these things on the map, to represent them in a particular way, and that's okay, because everyone designs a map to solve a particular task. The important thing is to recognize that that's happened. Where I think perhaps we're lucky now is that we have that underlying infrastructure of imagery and online tools that we can be the cartographers. We can choose what we want to represent and what's important for us when we create maps. So I guess that's that accessibility point. Now we are all cartographers if we choose to be.
Thanks very much, Ed. I'm afraid time has caught up with us. Thank you all very much indeed for coming tonight. Keep up the good work in 2025. If this was a New Year's resolution to make the most of your membership, great to see you here. Our spring lecture will continue next week. The lecture series continues next week with Professor Nikki Alsford speaking to the title, Henyo Voices, Merging Tradition and Science to Monitor Reef Changes. Following tonight's lecture, I'm pleased to say the bar in the map room will be open. It only remains for me to ask you to show your appreciation, please, for Ed and his fantastic speech this evening. Thank you.